Hello everyone, I am back. Today's video is an idea I've had for a while. I've always wanted to create some sort of enemy index or list, as the game itself doesn't really have one, so this video will be part 1 of that. Now before we begin, there are a few caveats and notes that I need to mention. Firstly, as there is no official index, most of these enemies don't have official names. Some do because they are mentioned in quests, but otherwise I'll have to use names commonly used in the Darkrise community, or I'll just have to make them up myself. Secondly, I will be entering every area on fatal difficulty. This is because some enemies have variants which makes them spawn in different colours and gives them better stats. Finally, if you think I've missed an enemy that spawned in the area that I was in, tell me in the comments and I will include them in future editions. The first enemy we'll look at is the small bat, as they are one of the first mobs you'll face in Crispy Shore. Now, considering they appear in the first area, you won't be surprised to find out that they have very low defensive and attacking stats. The fact that they fly does make them slightly awkward to hit if you're a warrior, for example, but other than that they are pretty harmless. We will talk more about bats later, as you progress through the game they do get more interesting, but for now we will move on to our next enemy. Next is the Knights, who I believe are the first enemy you encounter in Crispy Shore and also the most common enemy in Darkrise as a whole. Now, Knights can be kind of threatening. Their attacks do have the ability to stun and knock you back temporarily, and they also have decent defense, which isn't surprising as a Knight is supposed to have a lot of armor. There are different types of Knights and more appear as you progress through the game. For example, you have a Dark Knight, and this guy has even higher defense than a normal knight and also has this really interesting ability to spawn bats. Now you can turn this ability, if you are a low level character of course, into some sort of infinite XP / items farm, and I've done this before and it is quite fun. It's probably easier if you're a warrior, as an archer can auto shoot and so might end up killing the knights if you don't want to. You also have knights that lay mines that go off if you step on them, knights that shoot fireballs, and even a red one that flies. So overall, knights are really interesting, but they can be a problem, especially in higher areas. The last enemy to appear in Crispy Shore is the Witch, who appears at the end as a kind of final boss for the area. Now, the Witch is probably the first real challenge you'll face in Darkrise. It has several skills that Mage also has, including Water Push, which knocks you back, and Ball Lightning, which paralyzes you. If you can, using longer range attacks is better, as you can avoid being too near it. As you progress through the game, the Witch adds Toxic Cloud to its abilities, making it a lot more dangerous, and overall I would say that although the Witch is not very high in terms of health and defense, it is in my top 5 of enemies I hate the most. We are now in the second world area, which is Western Way, and we're going to start with an enemy that I had trouble naming. I ended up with Shield Holding Robber because in a later quest in another area, a group which includes this guy were called robbers, so I decided, do you know what, why not? There's nothing really special about this enemy, your character should face very little trouble dealing with it, and with that we're just going to move on to the next enemy. The next enemy in Western Way is also part of that robber group that I was talking about, so I called it a knife holding robber, though you could also call it a dagger holding robber if you really wanted to. Like our last enemy, he isn't much of a threat, so I wouldn't worry too much about him. I do however like the design of this enemy and the fact that it does a double slash attack before hitting you with one knife separately, so I think it's quite cool. Yes, we're back with the bats. I said I would return to these enemies, and here we are. Now, the bats in Western Way are bigger and darker than the ones in Crispy Shore, but overall, your character should find them easy enough to deal with. Like the Knights, there are different kinds of bats. When you reach the catacombs, you'll find the eye bat. It looks ugly and has massive teeth that it uses to bite you, but again, it should cause you no problems. Also, remember the small bats that we talked about earlier? They now do this. Luckily, this attack shouldn't be enough to kill you alone, so you should be fine. If you thought we were done talking about robbers, you would be wrong. I'm calling this enemy a spear throwing robber because it throws spears. Like other robbers, this guy is also not a big threat, though its ability to hit you from further away does make it more dangerous than the others. The last of the robber group and the last enemy from Western Way is the Barbarian, and he is the strongest enemy in the area. His huge axe deals a good amount of damage and knocks you back. He also has decent amount of defensive stats, meaning he can tank several hits before he dies. Basically, you're going to want to be careful around him. Now we've moved into the next area in Darkrise, which is Night Forest, and the first enemy you will encounter here is the Skeleton Swordsman. This enemy isn't particularly strong, so you should be able to deal with this threat fairly easily. However, this enemy, alongside other undead type mobs in Darkrise, have one special ability, and this is the ability to rise from the dead and come back to life. This is actually quite useful for you, as it means you can kill it again and thus get twice the amount of loot and XP. There's also a swordsman who carries a shield and has a bit more armor than a usual skeleton, but again, this should be no problem for your character. The next enemy we're going to look at is the Shadow Fighter. This enemy is slightly more threatening than the Skeleton Swordsman because it can inflict a condition that slows you down. Like the skeleton, it is an undead type, so it has the chance to revive and come back to life after you kill it. Again, not the most threatening, but interesting nonetheless. We're back to skeletons now, as we're talking about the Skeleton Archer. Again, not much different to the Skeleton Warrior apart from the fact that it is an archer. It does have the Hail of Arrows ability, so it can shoot multiple into the sky. It can also shoot an arrow directly at you. It also has, obviously, as an undead, the ability to revive and come back to life, but again, it is not a very threatening enemy. The last skeleton in this video is the Giant Skeleton. Now, as the name suggests, this enemy is pretty big. It can also fly, which can make it slightly awkward to hit, but then again, because it is so big, it is really hard to miss. It is probably the most dangerous in terms of attack out of all the skeleton types, because, you know, it is so big. It has the ability to knock you back if it hits you as well, and because it is an undead, it can rise from the dead if you kill it, which of course for you is an advantage if you're trying to grind and gain more XP. The final enemy we're going to be looking at in this video is the wolf. Now, I thought that wolves inflicted the bleed condition when they bit you, but the normal ones don't. However, they are one of the fastest enemies in Darkrise, which isn't surprising considering the animal that they are. And when they bite you, they do actually give you a decent amount of damage. After one of the recent updates, archers were actually given the ability to summon wolves, and they look exactly the same as enemy wolves, so it can get a bit confusing if you're using the ability in an area that spawns enemy wolves.